This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Alexandra Horowitz, who is an adjunct associate professor of psychology at Barnard College, Columbia University. She's the author of On Looking, 11 Walks with Expert Eyes, and Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know. Alexandra, welcome to Berkeley.
Thanks, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Philadelphia, and I mostly grew up in Colorado. My father moved out to Colorado, and so I was a quasi-Westerner early on.
And looking back, how did your parents influence your thinking about the world?
Oh, a lot. Both my parents were trained as attorneys. My dad still practices, and I think they have a very analytical approach to problem solving, to thinking. That was instilled in me from a pretty early age.
And what was the conversation like at the dinner table? About world events, about science, about what? Or about the law?
Well, in some ways, I think it was sometimes about the law, actually.
Yeah.
We talked about the law a fair amount, and that was pretty intriguing because there's a process, and I was interested in understanding the process and seeing that you could come to an end of a process. But also just about ordinary things, what happened in the day, and really analyzing what happened in our days, or a social interaction, or not just reporting, but also kind of ruminating on what it was. So we could have a long conversation about a one little incident that happened at the grocery store, at school, or walking the dog.
And when did you acquire your first dog, if acquire is the right word?
Right, I know. Ownership is a fraught question.
That's so when did you,
At that time we were all owners, though,
yeah,
right?
Yes.
And our family lived with dogs as long as I remember. I think from the time I was very young, we had a dog. My first dog I remember was maybe a dog named Heidi when I was 6. And then I grew up with the dog, and even in college, I maybe had a year or two in college where I didn't live with the dog, and then I had dogs in college. So I actually have always lived with dogs.
When you were younger and the family had a dog, did you find yourself observing them? I mean, were you a scientist in becoming at that point, or was just the friendship relationship?
I don't remember being scientific in my approach to the dog at all. I think what I had was a sensitivity to animals and plants, actually. I think I was just kind of worried about their experience or what was happening with them. And not to say I couldn't forget. I wasn't that sensitive a kid. But I wasn't analyzing them. I just wanted to be assured of their well-being. And that I can remember from very early age.
Mm-hmm. And so what were your first steps towards science? Was that when you went to college or even before then?
I had interest in science, but not behavioral science exactly. I was very interested in physics, and again, I liked an iterative process that led to a result. So that's very satisfying in math and in science as a secondary school student. In college, I got very interested in philosophy, and it actually diverted me from science a little bit, but was ultimately, I think, frustrating for that reason, wanting to come to a kind of end point, or at least periodic tentative endpoints that science allows you to progress through. So it wasn't until after I earned my BA and I was working and away from academics that I started thinking that I'd like to know more about some of these topics that I had just forgotten about, in pursuing, in pursuing philosophy, in particular cognition. And so that's when I started taking classes, and I wound up applying to a PhD program.
And where did you do your PhD?
At University of California, San Diego, in the cognitive science department.
So you're a cognitive psychologist, but are you also a zoologist and a person,
Well, you could almost say that. I mean, in a way, you get to be a little bit of a jack of all trades as a cognitive scientist, because the field itself was formed by philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists and anthropologists and computer scientists who were all realizing that they were asking similar questions, just approaching it in a different way, right? Artificial intelligence wants to know about the brain, and neuroscientists want to know whether their ideas of the brain could be mapped, programmed, and then there are observers of behavior, and then there are testers of behavior, and so forth. So from that position, I could be called any one of those things a little bit. I guess I'm never called as a neuroscientist or computer scientist, but I started studying animal behavior and became a little bit of what I would call a cognitive ethologist, right? Somebody who's looking at animal behavior naturally and observing, and then trying to make inferences about cognition.
And at San Diego, were there any particular people that you work with? Who did you do your dissertation on? And then how did you come to this focus on dogs?
I came to the focus on dogs a little bit accidentally. So I did start to get interested in animal cognition, in what kind of inferences we could make about non-human animal minds. And I was doing research with people who were studying the cognitive behavior of animals, the bonobos, for instance, or the social behavior of animals. I joined a rhinoceros observation research project at the Wild Animal Park under Ron Swaysgood. But then I got interested in dogs because I was interested in the topic of play as a natural behavior, which is so interesting in human development, and what might let us see something that allow us to make some inference about what the dogs understand or know. And so you'd look for a playing animal, and nobody I knew there was studying an animal who was playing all the time. You know, you could go and watch the bonobos, and they play once in a while, or they go off in the private area of the enclosure and they play, and you don't see them. But I realized that I was watching play 3 times a day. You know, I had a dog, and I was going out and watching play. And so I got interested in studying dogs, and there was no one studying dogs at UC San Diego, at least not in this way. But Mark Bekoff, who was at UC Boulder in Colorado, has studied dogs as a biologist for a long time. And I got in touch with him and really learned distance from him how to look at dog behavior. And then at UC San Diego, Shirley Strum in the anthropology department, who studies baboons, took me under her wing to help me refine my ethology technique. And Jeff Ellman, who was just somebody who could do anything, a kind of Renaissance intellect in the cognitive science department, took me on kind of intellectually. So I had a distant mentor in Mark Bekoff, and then Shirley Strum and Jeff Ellman were my committee chairs.
Well, I can't help asking this. Do you think there was a bias against dogs in the sense that no one, at least at San Diego, had undertaken this, in the sense that we sort of take them for granted?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. There was a huge bias against dogs, and I shared that bias against dogs. When I thought about, or somebody might have proposed to me, maybe you could study dogs, they're playing, and I really scoffed at the idea. First of all, you know, if you were interested in non-human animal minds, you were going to be looking at a primate, probably. Yeah. Because non-human primates are going to be the most connected to us. And so therefore, the ones that have the interesting answers to the questions you want to ask. And dogs are so familiar. I think I've tried to think back on why it could be that dogs were rejected as a cognitive subject in 1996 or something. And I think it was just we already had this vocabulary to talk about dogs. And so no one was studying dogs. I remember a well-known primatologist coming and visiting campus, and I had just started to observe dogs, and I said, gee, I think there's really something, this might have been 1998, there's something really interesting here, and what do you think about this? And he really laughed at that idea. And now he and many others are studying dogs. You know, it's really exploded as an interesting research topic, and I think a lot of people had that realization right at the same time in different parts of the world. There's a big group in Hungary, for instance, that was studying dogs.
And is it the case that I mean, I don't think your research has gone there yet, but that dogs, in a way, and our closeness to dogs could tell us really something about humans, basically,
Yeah.
in the sense of the interaction between the two, dogs and humans.
Certainly, yeah. Insofar as, you know, they are in many ways reflecting the process of our ancestors for some thousands of years. They reflect our selection of them, right? We might have chosen and decided to breed, intentionally or not, those animals that had traits that were most familiar or pleasing or recognizable, you know, reflected us, mirrored us in some way. And so they're a demonstration of what we think is important in a companion in some ways, and I think that makes them good companion animals and such easy companion animals. So there is a lot of interesting research, I think, which is comparative in that sense. I'm more interested in the dog qua dog, but yeah, they reflect back on us, certainly.
Have you ever thought of a comparison between dogs and cats, basically, in the sense that they're very different, but
As domesticated creatures,
yeah,
right.
as domesticated creatures, yeah.
Right, and the selection process must have been much different for cats. And that's because maybe you're starting with a really different species that doesn't have the same kind of sociality and interactions in their groups as the proto-dog or the ancestor wolf did in theirs. But also they're much less willing subjects, cats. So that's probably limited. There's probably a bias against cat cognition research because the cats, you know, just won't walk into the laboratory with you.
So what did you wind up doing your dissertation on then?
I did it on the behaviors of theory of mind, this metacognitive concept that we apply to humans, and a kind of case study of dogs at play. So dyadic interactions between dogs, rough and tumble play. So I was assessing that play behavior and seeing if there was anything that looked like it was a precursor to or a rudimentary understanding of others' minds.
Others being?
Dogs.
Dogs, yeah. Oh, other dogs.
Right, other dogs' minds.
Yeah, right. I like to ask my guests what they see as the skills involved in what you do, and how do you train to acquire those skills?
I think for my research, it's mostly about patience and observation. A lot of my research has to do with watching, and somehow that's a kind of attention skill that we don't develop that much in normal schooling, I think. Not just seeing, but really observing. And one way that's easier to do that is observing through video playback. So you videotape a lot of episodes of a behavior, and then you watch it in slow motion, and you start seeing something different happening. And so that's where patience really comes in. I mean, watching dogs play is great fun, but the science of it only happens when you're watching a 30th of a second at a time of that video playback, which is extremely tedious, you know, and writing sequential behaviors down. So a 30-second playback might take hours to code effectively. And so you'll have to be interested in the observation, and then you have to be very patient to deconstruct it.
And when you say code, explain to our audience what you mean by that.
So any behavior, any anthropologist or ethologist would be interested in finding out the parts of that behavior. We might say an interview is happening here, but what constitutes that interview? And there are various levels at which you could describe this behavior that's happening between us. And we choose some level. We're not interested in finger movements or limb extensions, but instead maybe we're interested in the conversation. And a code would be making a representation such that you could look at lots of different instances of conversations and see if there are patterns that are similar across those coded behaviors.
And in the case of a dog who, when you come to the study of the dog, there isn't an enormous literature, that this breakdown becomes, there's just an awful lot going on, that it's only through this kind of careful observation that you can see that.
Right. I think that we see play, for instance, in dogs as a unitary behavior. It's just right, they're playing, and then that's kind of the end of the assessment of what's happening. But you could break it down into smaller components. You could look at how they're using each other's attention when they're communicating. You could look at dominant, submissive behaviors. There are lots of ways you could do it. And I used an ethogram, a list of behaviors, to code the behaviors I was looking at from Mark Beckhoff and other people who had studied dog behavior, and also from people who had studied other animal behavior. So ethologists all use each other's ethograms to get ideas about what are the kinds of behaviors we might see in this animal. And now there are pretty exhaustive lists of ethograms of different animals' behaviors.
So in a way, it becomes like reading encrypted conversations between humans. In other words, once you break the encryption, you know, there's a whole conversation going on, whether between dogs or between dogs and humans.
Right, that make the conversation work, right, or that make the play work, the constituent elements. Now, your analogy only breaks down insofar as that doesn't mean we suddenly understand its meaning all the time.
No,
but we certainly have analyzed it at a different level, and so we might have gained another appreciation for instance, how dogs use turn-taking in play, even if we don't then understand play.
And you're really exposing the complexity, which might be an entry point to other complexities in the relationship of the dogs to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I got interested in play because it's a context in which it's possible that in humans we learn a lot of understanding of others. So by playing with this real pretend distinction early in childhood, we might start realizing, oh, there's more than one way to view this, you know, banana I'm holding up to my ear. It's not just a banana, but it's also a phone. And then, oh, that person in front of me might not know the things I do. They know something else. It seems to be part of that development. So one wonders, if one looks at play in other species, if they're also based on an understanding that the dogs would use in other contexts, which is of another animal's perspective, that they know or believe or think different things than that dog believes.
What other qualities of temperament besides patient? It sounds like there's a lot of empathy, really. Is that
for me? That definitely was a grounding for my interest in looking at animals, right? And I think that's probably the case for a lot of other animal behavior researchers. And you know, a real sense of connection with a non-human animal of any kind, and an interest, a curiosity about other animals, and desire to not just have a simple answer as to what the animal is doing and what the animal is feeling, but to really analyze their behavior before jumping to any conclusion.
Now, what was your goal in writing the inside of the dog? Obviously, in part, it was reporting on your research. But beyond that, were there other goals involved here?
You know, I was then a dog researcher. I had gotten interested in the dog, as opposed to just as this theory of mind entry into non-human animal minds. And I lived with dogs, and one of my interests was in that tension, being a scientist of dogs and also an owner of or liver with dogs, and how we have two different approaches to the dog. So I was wearing kind of two different hats all the time. You know, the ways you deal with a dog in your house and the ways we looked at dogs analytically, and an interest to bringing the latter to the former, not just for me, but for other owners and saying, well, what are, these are questions we form about our dogs. What do they know? What are they thinking? What do they understand? What do they think of me? People would always ask me, what does my dog think of me? And is there anything I could bring from my approach or my results or the other dog researchers' results to date, which would bear on those questions? So, it's realizing that there's a universe of people who live with dogs, who have questions about them, and that now there's this science that wasn't that well reported on at that point, which would be fascinating to them.
Mm-hmm. What is, in your work, what does creativity look like? I mean, what can you tell us about an aha moment where you suddenly came on something that was really surprising for you, say in the area of play? Or
well, it was, I guess I have a couple of possibilities that leaped to my mind. One was even finding out about the possibility of dogs as a cognitive subject. Mm-hmm. And that happened through reading Mark Bekoff and Colin Allen's book, Species of Mind. And I distinctly remember Mark, who was studying the behavior of dogs in play, made a suggestion that maybe there's something about shared intentionality, understanding of intentionality in these play bows that they do, the play signals, which seem to be something like request for play or an announcement that I'm about to play with you, and precede play and continue throughout play, and are very important for play. And so he just made the suggestion that there was something metacognitive, basically, about the dog's very simple act of, going down on their front legs with their rump high in the air and wagging their tail. And that was extreme. That moment was really inspiring because I was very interested in the metacognitive aspects or possibilities in non-human animal minds. Are they thinking about thinking? Are they thinking about others thinking? And here somebody was saying a very simple behavior, if you looked at the context, might be connected to that. So I thought, whoa, I've got to look at that. And that's really what I then spent 2 years of research looking at. Mm-hmm. So that was a big moment. And I also think before I started writing this book and I got interested in more of how the science could elucidate the experience of the dog, I was reading other biologists and came across Jakob von Uexküll, who was influential in some areas of animal behavior research, but had kind of fallen out of the popular literature. He wasn't really in favor, I guess, by the 20 years ago in animal behavior research. You didn't hear his name a lot, but he had this idea of the Umwelt of the animal, that you could imagine the worldview, the soap bubble in which any animal existed, defined by the things that are important or salient in their environment and their own sensory capacity. And that really tickled me, right? And I realized, he's telling me how to find out what the experience of the dog is, which is figure out what's important in their environment from their point of view, watch their behavior to do that, and understand their senses, and therefore get a different picture of what they experience in a space. And we can do that, and so that was a big moment too, and that's still very influential in my thinking about how to research dog behavior. And
in a way, that sort of defines the agenda for your book. And I want to walk you through your book, and you really identify 3 broad areas that you want to look at. State what those are, and then I'll walk you through each of them.
The sensory areas? Well, olfaction. That's a huge sensory area. Mm-hmm. There's a visual area, and who's going to be in their visual space. And I'm not sure what the other third area you're thinking of is.
I guess what I meant was the overall framework of the book. So it's looking at the dog's origins, its sensibility,
then their senses.
Their senses, and then their interaction with humans.
That's true. All right. So, right. Absolutely.
That's how I saw the book.
No, that's great. Well, everybody reads it a different way.
Yeah.
That is all in there. Right. So where does this dog come from? Who is the dog? And then what are their sensory capacities, perceptual experiences, and then
interaction
with humans, and what do they see of us, and how have we influenced their biology and the interaction and the bond.
So let's begin with the origins. They come, their origins is in the family of wolves, I guess you would say. So, but we don't think about having a wolf in our house these days.
Right.
So
and I don't think there's any atavistic possibility that the dog is going to become the wolf again. Yeah.
Right, right. Maybe on television, but we'll leave that aside. But so what? Talk a little about that, because what as I read your book, what you're saying basically is it drew some positive things from coming from that line, but on the other hand, there were major changes in its evolution. So what is it about a wolf that could be the starting point for a dog?
Well, I'll say first of all that I think the domestication story is still unfolding, right? There's still people who are trying to and claim to find the earliest examples of the divergence between the early canid ancestor, a kind of wolf, and dogs. And it might have happened in multiple places, but it looks like at some point, I think one of the best theories is really Ray Coppinger's theory, which is that dogs, or proto-dogs, some wolves kind of self-selected right about when humans were becoming less nomadic and having settlements. And with any settlement, you kind of create trash outside of your settlement, the food that goes uneaten, the early dumps. And some wolves might have already a social species and felt less wary of this animal in their environment and approach this new food source, a new ecological niche, basically, that we created inadvertently, and therefore came into closer proximity with these early humans, and then might have started to be taken in by us, and maybe because some of them were appealing to us as puppies, maybe partly for food, something like that, and then artificial selection started after that. So this was a species, and I want to make clear, it wasn't today's wolf, right? It's some ancestor of today's wolf. So we look at the wolf today and we think, well, the dog came from that wolf. But of course, that wolf has also evolved over thousands of years from this common ancestor. Some early wolf must have had a reduction in reactivity to humans and felt less fearful, and therefore allowed for the possibility that we could come into interaction. And we created an environmental scenario that encouraged the possibility of that interaction. And then some spark happened between us.
And you're saying that wolves, these ancestor wolves, brought to the table characteristics that were useful for this transition, that helped make it possible. And you describe the relationship of the wolf to his own pack, and then the adaptation and flexibility of the ancestor wolf in its original setting.
Right. So the wolves are social already. And they live in social groups, and these are packs, and these are really family units. So that's already mirroring, as happens with other social mammals too, but that's already mirroring something about us. We're living in extended family units, and so are wolves. And the alpha pair are really the eldest of this family. And so that's a very tight-knit group. They're somewhat territorial, but extremely affiliative with each other. And so that makes them mirror in some way the kind of human social relationship that we have now and that we've always had. And so if only we could start to see each other as kind of conspecifics, and they have some flexibility in that, at least the dogs that we've selected do, then we could interweave in each other's families. So they must have had some early developmental flexibility, such that the difference between wolves and dogs now is that dogs have a much longer sort of sensitive period where they could be exposed to other species and view them as conspecifics, as essentially part of their own family. Wolves are shorter, but there must have been some sufficient extension in those early self-selecting wolves so that they could come to accept a human.
And you say that in the book that it's really a difference in how long it takes for the baby dog or wolf to open their eyes, which then, in the case of the dog, there's a longer period, which is a threshold or a starting point for feeling affection for something other than another dog or the mother dog, but they could extend it to a different species.
Right, essentially a sensitive period, or a critical, it used to be called a critical period. If you're talking about some species, a very regimented early window for social exposure or for hearing sounds of their species and so forth. It's critical period. If it's a little bit looser, it's a sensitive period. So some broader sensitive window in the dog eventually than in the wolf. Conrad Lorenz discovered this idea or popularized the idea of the critical period, and he famously exposed himself, I mean that in the most literal way, not in the extended way, but he removed some goslings from their mother, and he was the first individual those goslings saw, and they imprinted on him, right? So that's a kind of flexibility that lots of animals have, that is, whoever the first creature is you see, that's the one you attach yourself to and mimic and you're going to rely on. But it's a very brief window for geese. It's the broader window for some mammals.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about the what's inside the dog, its senses, its sensibility, and so on. And what is the most important thing that we need to know about its senses? Which is the most important?
I think everyone knows at some level that the dog is an olfactory creature, but they are entirely olfactory. It's not that they don't have other senses, but as we are visual creatures, and as most of our experiences at this moment are experiences of images, not so much smells and not so much, it's hearing, of course, but not primarily our overarching experience is visual, they are olfactory. And so that's, to then really loiter in that fact for a while and sit and steep in it and think about what it would be like to be an olfactory creature whose experience of this room would not be of the sights, but instead of places where smells are coming from, or smells that are here from past guests and past passersby and so forth. I think that's transformative to think of the dog that way. So they're not the only olfactory creature, but they're the only one living in our homes, as it were. And so that's manifest in a number of ways. They have many millions more olfactory receptors, which gives them exponentially greater sensitivity to the presence of any smell than we would have. They have a sophisticated method of sniffing, so that just as we don't get inured to something we're looking at or staring at, they can keep smelling, inhaling, without kind of exhaling the smell out of their nose. In fact, their exhales kind of help their inhales. They have this secondary olfactory-like organ called the vomeronasal organ in the hard palate of the roof of the mouth to allow smelling hormones, emitted hormones, obviously functionally adaptive to deal with other members of their species, but also presumably they're able to detect the hormones that we're always giving off, pheromones, we would call it. So they're entirely organized around smell, and their vision is perfectly good. But I think that's the thing to realize when trying to imagine, if one is really interested in imagining the dog's point of view, is that when you step out into the street and this world just appears for us however it appears, their world is appearing to them as the smells passing on the breeze, or whatever smell is underfoot or is left on that lamppost.
Mm-hmm. And in using this smell strength, so to speak, they're acquiring information, basically. So what you're saying is we need to think of it in that way, because they are learning about their environment, the people in the environment, through that, and they're decoding the information.
That's right. I mean, I think that when we're using vision, we're getting information too, right? And we think of smells, I think, it's hard for us to imagine being olfactory creatures because we assign smells a quality. You know, it's like a good smell or a bad smell, and maybe they're identities, and there are some people who are very good at recognizing what the smells are, but mostly we just kind of think, well, there's a set of smells we like and a set of smells we don't like. But we think of vision as giving us information about the world. Oh, this is where I am, this is who is here, this is what happened. I might see some sign that somebody was here before. And I think that's exactly how they're drawing a picture of their space with olfaction. So it's not laden with, is this a good or bad smell? It's whose smell is that? And what information is there in the urine that's splattered this hydrant about the urinator and her health and her sexual status and maybe her stress hormone level. I don't know. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what they could experience, but they have the capacity to pull out all that bits of information. And so about humans as well, who pass by, you know, hence the effectiveness of trackers who, they don't need a footstep, you know, they just need somebody having kind of sloughed our smell in our wake as we run away for the dog to detect that we were there sometime in the past. So then, they might even be sort of smelling time because the difference between a strong odor and a weak odor is really when it was laid. You know, so strong odor means somebody passed more recently. So it is entirely information.
And you talk a little about this whole question of whether dogs can tell whether their companion is ill, basically. Their human companion has a disease and so on.
Sure, and there's no reason that the dog wouldn't be able to smell that. I mean, any diseased cells give off a very distinctive smell. I mean, doctors used to be trained in, reliably trained in the smells of diseases. You know, I think tuberculosis or something like sort of a brown bread smell. So instead of just getting a blood test from you, you know, a doctor might come over and just see if you're giving off a smell that would be informative about you, right? Not good or bad, but informative. And so we're giving off those smells. And we know that dogs can then detect, you know, the changes of tissue wrought by cancer, for instance, because dogs are easily trained, and many have been trained, to alert to cancerous cells in whatever the substrate, on a body, if it's a melanoma, or in urine, if it's bladder cancer you're trying to detect, or in breath, if it's lung cancer. So they are detecting them. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's dog is looking for illness in their owner, right? But my guess is that they might notice it, and then if we asked them, trained them to tell us, and we knew what they're telling us looked like, then they could also tell us about it.
And do they compute? In other words, is there evidence that they can combine their affection for someone with this detection of disease to then try to alert the person? I mean, that would be different than just smelling a bunch of people that they don't know for disease.
Right. So you could be trained on an odor or a component of a component inherent in a cancer, for instance. And that's what the dogs who are trained to do this do. And so your question is really sort of, does familiarity breed a kind of smell understanding such that if there's a violation of that smell understanding, a change wrought by an illness, a dog would detect it and be able to tell you about it, essentially. And
because of their affection for you,
Yeah, well, I guess I was translating affection as familiarity, but because I'm just trying to say, well, why would they be affectionate? Because if they have a relationship with you, you know, they're familiar. Presumably so, yes. I mean, the answer would be, of course, they will notice the difference if there is a difference to be noted. But I still think it's a big, you know, then you have to notice that they're noticing, which is a hard thing for us to do, given that, you know, we live among dogs and we notice very little of their behavior, as far as I'm concerned. In the ordinary course, we aren't really looking and trying to understand what they're doing by watching them. We're kind of putting an understanding on them and then assuming they live up to it. So I don't think we would notice they're noticing.
Interestingly, do these olfactory sensibilities, obviously they must apply to other dogs, not just to humans. So this is sort of key to their ability to play, choosing their playmates to the extent that they're not chosen for them. Is that
Right.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So this sensibility is at work and play.
Sure, I think in any social interaction with
Yeah.
other dogs, right? And determining how, if it's a competitive scenario and there's food or attention being doled out, you could use information about the health or age of another dog to make a decision about whether you're stronger or more likely to get that attention, or if this is a good, well-matched playmate and so forth.
You compare the dog to their wolf ancestors, and you discern a difference in the intelligence or the kind of intelligence that a dog has. I think you say wolves are better at working at puzzles, whereas the dog is more a creature that relates to the other to get information. Talk a little about that, because this is and I think you then also discussed the notion of working on objects, basically. Talk a little about that. How they use their senses to deal with their environment beyond
Right.
just being an observer of it.
There are a lot of types of tasks that would be put to a dog or any other animal in a kind of comparative psychology approach. And there's a lot of research, this is not my research, but research of others, looking at really their physical cognition skills, which would be kind of the problem-solving skills for the most part, and then social cognition skills, which would be problem-solving that involves other individuals. And so wolves and dogs put to the same physical cognition tasks, perform quite differently, with wolves usually surpassing dogs if you want to talk about who's the better performer. So a nice test is a kind of impossible box task where, let's say there's a piece of rope that's attached to meat and that's secreted inside a box, and the animal has to learn to pull the rope and get the meat. And both wolves and dogs can do this, but then if it's impossible to open, and you pull it and you can't get the box open, it's really well fastened, the wolf will really go at that task, and they will figure out a way, or they will die trying, essentially, to get inside. They're intent on it. And a dog, alternately, will go at it a little bit, and then usually, typically, the average dog, if there is such a thing, gives up, And then they do something very interesting, which is the social cognitive part, which is to say they look to the person who, incidentally, is the one almost always solving problems for dogs. If my dog wants to have food, she doesn't go forage for food or try to discover it on her own. She just comes to me, and voila, I am the one who solves that problem every time. And so dogs seem to be very good at using us as the kind of tool to solve any problem. But they're sort of failing the physical cognition test. So that's an interesting reason that maybe some comparative psychology methods and the answers you traditionally say they give don't work as well for dogs. They've failed the task, but they've also really succeeded because they've got a much better tool. They don't have to go at that until they die. They can just pester the person, and the person's probably going to help them solve the puzzle. And so then that's the social cognition part, and they perform much better than wolves. One of the methodologies that has, for some reason, really hit it off, and a lot of different researchers in this field have studied it, is like dog success of following points or gaze. And they're very good at that, much, much better than wolves, for the most part, unless wolves have lived among humans, and even better than chimps, so better than our closest relatives. And that seems so automatic, right? You point someplace and the dog kind of knows that that's something there. But a chimp, when you point, they'll look at the end of your finger, not at the place which humans say we're obviously intending, that place over there on the floor, not this thing that I'm using as information. And dogs seem to get this very early on, given the right development. And so that's an interesting skill that allows them to get all sorts of information from us. They can follow our gaze this way. And it also means they're looking at our faces a lot, which incidentally, I think is greatly implicated in our humans' feelings that dogs really understand us, that we're really in a conversation together. Because guess what? They just look at us. You know, I think they're probably smelling more than looking, but they're directed toward us just as in a conversation. So they really succeed at social cognitive tasks, and the wolves are less good at that, probably because they're less trained at, less driven to look at a face. You know, most
Which they
animals,
don't do. You say,
where
yeah.
they don't typically do that. If they're
Yeah.
not exposed to humans, eye contact, you know, prolonged eye contact would not be tolerated. That's really a threat, not, you know, you wouldn't want to go up to a wolf and just stare at them. And also, just same with the dog you don't know, for instance, but the dog you do know, you might just sit there and gaze at each other, and that really feels like it's the basis for an understanding. And other animals don't do that. They use gaze as threats. So wolves won't really look us in the face for a long period. They're not getting information from our gaze and from our points, and so they're going to fail at those social cognitive tasks relative to dogs.
So what you're describing is a real justification for your point of the book, which is to get into the Umwelt of the dog, because if you were doing intelligence testing, you might conclude, well, the dog is a dummy.
Right.
But what you're saying is, no, you got to look at the context, which is that they are a social animal, whereas a wolf is really only social within its own pack.
Yeah, they're so social with us, and that's their real skill. And I think understanding the dog's perspective there is that the social world has extended to include the human, and that's quite a skill.
Mm-hmm. You look at this relationship between humans and dogs, and it's almost a marriage made in heaven, so to speak. And you talk about things that the commonality that leads us to meet each other in this relationship, and one is contact, right? In other words, that both humans and dogs like to be touched, basically.
Yeah, you know, and I think that, and touch is affiliative, you know, it's affectionate. It's, and dogs kind of suffer being touched by us, you know. I mean, they like to be touched. They'll sleep, wolves, their relations would sleep together and on top of each other and so forth. But also dogs will seem to endure all sorts of types of touching from us, regardless of if we're family members or not, you know, and that's very appealing. If you looked just anthropologically, if you watched people go by a pet store and how they interacted with the inhabitants of that pet store who they'd never met, you know, most people want to touch the animal, right? That's very important for us. And dogs will allow that. That's part of their way of interacting with each other.
And there's a kind of a mutual signaling, which I guess you're saying the dog originally got that from the wolves returning to the pack, but they've sort of crossed species, and so this whole greeting thing is a big deal in the relationship.
Yeah. So when a hunting dog returns to his or her pack and has made a kill, they really are mobbed by, you know, their pack members. And there is a big greeting, and it is a greeting. It's very exciting, and they do all this licking around the face of the returning hunter, and that prompts the hunter to regurgitate some of the food to share to everybody. And it's so interesting to see that same behavior within human homes, where you have, you know, we return and our dog comes and jumps at us and licks at our face, and it is just a greeting to us, you know. In fact, we call it a kiss. A dog licks your face, people call it kisses, you know, something. And so then that's the end of our definition of it. And I think it is interesting to go back one step and say, oh, right, and then usually the returning dog would have regurgitated some of the food to everybody, and we rarely do that. I don't know that the dog would be unhappy if we did, but So I think it is a greeting, but you get some more knowledge about the history of that greeting from looking at their ancestors.
And when this licking, when you come back from a restaurant, I mean, they're gathering information. I mean, they're not yet ready to say, "Oh, you went to Chez Panisse for dinner while
Right.
you left me here."
Right.
But in other words, they are absorbing information. Is that information useful for them, or does it just give them security to input this information?
Well, I mean, look at it this way. If we have information that we've been eating something, and the origin of this licking was to provoke sharing of that eating, then they would, the smell would prompt them to do more and more of it, you know, to try to, as a request, to try to get us to share it with them. So it's informative in that way. Otherwise, I don't think they put it in the bank, you know, and then she went out every night and she had pizza 5 times and then she had Chinese food. But I don't think, but certainly it would have been useful to get information. Yeah, and so all the smelling, you know, and think of all the smells we must pick up, not just of other dogs, as it were, that we might have touched in the world, but just smells that are hitting us from the world as we travel through our environment, which that dog's nose is sensitive to. That's information for them about, in some way, about where we've been or who we've been interacting with, and it is, I think, interesting to them.
And finally, you emphasize the timing of the relationship, that in other words, which is about what? It may help us.
For instance, there is a lot of turn-taking and mutual looking and checking back and looking away, which is very reminiscent between dog and human, which is very reminiscent of how humans deal with each other in conversation. There's some very nice studies showing that the sort of bouncing back and forth of actions between, or gaze between dog and human is very similar to flirting, mixed-sex strangers' behaviors between each other, you know, so they're doing something in interaction with us, even without words, you know, even without the same understanding, which is familiar to us, which is just is appealing to us and fits into our model of how you deal with others. And so we slip them right into that category of others.
When we started, you mentioned the fact that you were someone who had companionship with dogs. I won't use the word owner. And so I'm curious now to look back and ask how you as a dog person has informed your science and how your science has informed you as a dog person.
I think living with dogs informed my science by changing the types of questions I ask. You know, I'm very interested in the fact that we have an entire vocabulary. People who live with dogs have an entire vocabulary to describe their dogs, you know, right from very early living with their dogs, all these anthropomorphisms we put on the dogs about their understanding and what they think and want and what they think of us. And that functions pretty well, actually. It might not be right, it might be right, but it just functions pretty well for the entirety of that dog's life with that person. And those aren't the types of questions that comparative psychology usually asks. They ask, you know, do you follow a point? You know, or as I did in Approach, you know, does a dog have a kind of theory of mind or a rudimentary theory of mind? And I think those are interesting questions, but I've moved away from those a little bit, and I'm asking more the types of questions about whether those words that we use to describe dogs when we're living with dogs are correct, or if there's a better explanation, or if there's something where we can get a better understanding of the dog by using different words. And so I think that's what living with dogs has done to my science. What the science has done to my living with dogs is, I think, made me a much better owner. And I will use that word, it's just a convenient word, but I don't think of myself as owning dogs per se. It's just explains that relationship. I've become a much better observer. I think I've become a much better, much more conscientious person living with dogs, and much more sensitive to what the dog might need or desire or want, or what the dog's telling me. So, gee, now I understand when the dog is trying to get my attention for something important that they need, the very few things they ask of us, food or going outside or interaction, much earlier, so you can kind of change the way a dog gets your attention. Instead of having to ramp it up until they're barking at you and annoying you, you can see when they just come and, touch your knee with their nose as a request and see, you're communicating with me. I'm going to see what you want. That's very satisfying. I mean, if you're seeing what the dog's saying, that's very satisfying. And I also am much more appreciative of letting my dogs smell the world, right? So I describe in my book too the smell walks we take, where this whole predefined interaction that we have with dogs, where we're going to take them for a walk. Everyone knows if you get a dog, you have to take them for walks, right? And mostly that's about elimination, and maybe it's about exercise. But boy, let's say you're a dog who's inside for 20 hours a day, with maybe nobody to deal with for most of that because people you lived with are working. What would be great? Going for a walk. Why? Not just so that you can urinate, but also or see other dogs, which is very important. I think everyone agrees on that. But also you can smell what the world is like. So, what if we took walks where every time they want to stop and smell, and we're pulling at their leashes to, come on, hurry up, we have to take a walk. We realize that's their walk. They're walking. This is what the experience is, and letting them enjoy that or experience it, whatever it is. And I love that now. I love seeing my dogs do that and letting them live out their noses a little bit. So that's only since really I started studying dogs that I did that. I didn't know that ahead of time. It was only through reflecting on their capacity that I realized I should change my way of walking my dog.
Well, one of the themes in this book and in your new book on I can't remember on looking is you have a very strong interest in attention, right? And I think you say in that second book that our environment really makes us unattentive, and part of what you're interested in is how do we regain that attention and so on. Talk a little about that, because it's clearly a theme, in the focus that you have on cognition.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I wouldn't, in cognition, attention is a whole specialty. And I never was drawn to that. So I think it's a different type of meaning of attention. I think now that you mention it, what it is an interest in looking in a different way at something which is familiar. In some sense, that is a connection between my recent writing and my research and writing about dogs. There is a very familiar thing. We already know about it. Maybe some people psychology didn't even think that the dog was worth studying cognitively, because we already know. Here's an ordinary block in a city, which is a walk I took again and again for on looking. We already know what's on the block, and we don't need to look. And so we've lost a type of attention to object or scene, which actually, has a lot of levels of richness that we could notice. And I'm, as opposed to being attracted to the exotic, I think I'm kind of attracted to getting different perspectives on the ordinary. And so I think that's the attention I'm interested in bringing, like a new way of looking at something familiar.
And so dogs were a good field of study for you.
I think so,
because you say they're anthropologists of us and their world.
Yeah, right. And they're looking at us in an interesting way. I really admire how well they look at us and observe our behavior.
Well, Alexandra, this has been a fascinating conversation. Let me show your book again, because I think it's a great read, and people are going to want to come to it for that reason, but also because of their interest in dogs. Thank you very much for coming on our program.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.